In the summer of 1976, a Soviet air defense commander received a report that made him go quiet for a long moment before he responded. An American aircraft had just set two world records on the same day, an absolute altitude record of 85,069 feet and an absolute speed record of 2,193 miles per hour. Mach 3.3, three times the speed of sound, sustained in level flight. No aircraft in history had ever done anything close to it. The commander already knew about the plane. Everyone in Soviet air defense knew about it. They had been trying to shoot it down for years. They had never come close. Over the entire operational life of the SR-71 Blackbird, Soviet forces fired more than 4,000 missiles at it. Surface-to-air missiles, air-to-air missiles, every weapon in the Soviet arsenal directed at a single aircraft. The score was 4,000 missiles fired, 0 hits, 0 kills. Not once, in over 2 decades of operations, did the Soviets manage to touch it. But the part of this story that Moscow liked least, the part they buried deepest, was not the failure to shoot it down. It was something far more humiliating. The metal that made the SR-71 untouchable, the material that allowed it to survive the heat of Mach 3 flight without tearing itself apart, had been purchased from the Soviet Union itself. The CIA had bought it through shell companies, through third-world intermediaries, through layers of deception so thorough that Moscow had no idea. The country that spent 20 years trying to destroy the Blackbird had supplied the raw materials to build it. This is the story of the SR-71, the aircraft that made the Soviet Union feel, for the first time, genuinely helpless. To understand why the SR-71 existed, you have to go back to a moment of catastrophic embarrassment for American intelligence. On May 1, 1960, a Soviet surface-to-air missile brought down a CIA U-2 spy plane deep inside Soviet territory. The pilot, Francis Gary Powers, survived the shoot-down and was captured. The incident was a diplomatic disaster of the first order. The United States had been caught conducting covert overflights of Soviet territory, had initially denied it, and then been confronted with the living proof sitting in a Moscow interrogation room. Khrushchev was furious. The Paris summit collapsed, and the CIA was faced with an urgent and uncomfortable question. If the Soviets could shoot down a U-2, how were they supposed to keep watching them? The answer was already being designed in a secret facility in Burbank, California, inside a division of Lockheed that had no official name, only a nickname borrowed from a place in a popular cartoon strip, the Skunk Works. The man running it was Clarence Kelly Johnson, one of the most gifted aerospace engineers in American history, a man who had already produced some of the most advanced aircraft in the world, and who now had a new problem to solve. He needed to build something that nothing on Earth could catch. The solution he arrived at was almost impossible by the engineering standards of the 1960s. The aircraft would fly at altitudes above 80,000 feet, so high that the atmosphere was barely present, so high that the sky above the cockpit was black even in daylight. And it would fly at speeds above Mach 3, 3 times the speed of sound, faster than any missile the Soviets could reliably aim and launch at something moving that fast at that altitude. The physics were brutal. At Mach 3, the friction of the air against the aircraft's skin generates temperatures that would melt aluminum, the standard material for aircraft construction. Johnson needed something else, something that could withstand the heat without adding so much weight that the aircraft became impossible to fly. The answer was titanium. Lightweight, extraordinarily heat-resistant, strong enough to hold its shape at temperatures that would destroy conventional materials. titanium was the only material that could make the SR-71 possible. There was just one problem. The United States did not have sufficient sources of the specific ore needed to produce the quality of titanium the project required. The major global supplier of that ore was the Soviet Union. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary episodes in Cold War history. The CIA, working through a network of front companies and third-world intermediaries, arranged to purchase Soviet titanium ore on the open market, route it through countries that had no obvious connection to the United States, process it, and deliver it to Lockheed's Skunk Works in Burbank. The Soviets sold it without knowing what it was for. The material moved through the global supply chain, changed hands multiple times, and arrived at the facility where American engineers were using it to build a surveillance aircraft that would spend the next 20 years watching Soviet military installations from the edge of space. The Soviet Union supplied the metal. American ingenuity built the weapon. And then the weapon flew straight over everything Moscow was trying to hide. The SR-71 entered service with the United States Air Force in January 1966. 32 were built in total. The aircraft was unlike anything that had ever flown. Its skin was matte black, not for aesthetics, but because the black paint absorbed radar energy, making the aircraft harder to detect. The shape itself was designed around the earliest principles of stealth technology, with sharp edges and smooth blended surfaces that scattered radar returns rather than reflecting them cleanly back to the source. At altitude and speed, the Blackbird was a ghost. Inside the cockpit, the experience of flying it was unlike anything else in military aviation. The aircraft expanded and contracted with temperature. At cruising speed, the heat of Mach 3 flight caused the airframe to grow by several inches. On the ground, the fuel tanks actually leaked, because the panels that sealed them were designed to fit only when the aircraft had expanded to its operational dimensions at speed. Pilots would take off carrying only enough fuel to climb and accelerate, then refuel immediately from a tanker aircraft before pushing the throttles forward and watching the world fall away below them. Within minutes, they would be at 80,000 feet, moving at over 2,000 miles per hour, watching entire countries pass beneath them in the time it took to drink a cup of coffee. And across those years, the Soviets tried everything to stop it. Soviet air defense commanders understood what the SR-71 was doing. It was photographing their military installations, their missile sites, their naval bases, their troop movements, their most sensitive facilities, from an altitude and speed at which no interceptor could reliably reach it, and no missile could reliably track it. The intelligence it gathered was priceless. The humiliation of being unable to stop it was constant. The primary Soviet interceptor assigned to deal with the SR-71 was the MiG-25 Foxbat, a remarkable aircraft in its own right, designed specifically as a high-speed, high-altitude interceptor capable of reaching Mach 2.8 and altitudes above 60,000 feet. It was the fastest combat aircraft the Soviet Union had ever built, developed in large part because of the threat posed by the Blackbird. The MiG-25 was the Soviet answer to American aerial supremacy, an aircraft built from the ground up to kill one specific target. It was not enough. The SR-71 flew at 85,000 feet. The MiG-25 could reach perhaps 62,000 feet in optimal conditions. The Blackbird was 23,000 feet above the ceiling of the Soviet interceptor, specifically designed to destroy it. Soviet pilots would scramble, push their aircraft to the absolute limit of their performance, and watch the American plane simply fly away from them, not accelerating, not maneuvering, not doing anything dramatic, just maintaining cruise speed, which was faster than anything the Soviet pilots could reach even at full afterburner. Retired Soviet MiG-31 pilot Major Mikhail Mayaki later recalled that the speed and altitude of the SR-71 simply hypnotized everyone who saw it on radar. Each interception attempt was treated as a top priority for the entire Soviet air defense network, and every single one ended the same way. The Blackbird flew on, untouched, and the Soviet aircraft turned back. The missiles were no better. Over the course of the SR-71's operational life, Soviet and other hostile forces fired more than 4,000 missiles at the aircraft. The standard response when a surface-to-air missile launch was detected was simple and brutal. The pilot pushed the throttles to full power and accelerated. The SR-71 could outrun the missiles. Not dodge them, outrun them. The missiles could not maintain lock on an aircraft moving that fast at that altitude. They would exhaust their fuel, chasing something they could never reach. SR-71 pilot Brian Schul later wrote that on one occasion, flying over Libya in 1986 after American airstrikes, he pushed the aircraft past Mach 3.5 to evade a missile. The missile never came close. He described the experience of watching a threat appear on his instruments and then simply driving away from it as one of the most extraordinary moments of his flying career. For Soviet air defense commanders, each failed intercept was a report that had to be written and filed. Each missile fired and missed was ammunition expended for nothing. The Blackbird flew routes along the Soviet periphery, peering deep into the country's most sensitive territory with cameras and sensors of extraordinary capability. And there was nothing the Soviet military could do about it. The most powerful air defense network on Earth, equipped with the most advanced interceptors and surface-to-air missile systems available, watched helplessly as an American aircraft conducted reconnaissance operations with what the Smithsonian Institution later described as complete impunity. There is a final irony that sits at the heart of this story, one that Soviet officials never publicly acknowledged. The titanium that made the SR-71 possible, the material that allowed it to withstand Mach 3 heat, that gave it its strength and its resilience, that made it the most capable reconnaissance aircraft ever built, had come from Soviet mines. The CIA's shell companies had purchased it through channels the Soviets never detected, routed it through countries that raised no suspicion, and delivered it to Lockheed's engineers. The Soviet Union, in selling that ore, had unknowingly funded and supplied the construction of the aircraft that would spend 20 years making them feel helpless. When the full story finally became known, decades later, it was the kind of detail that required a moment to absorb. The Soviets had tried for years to shoot down the Blackbird. They had fired thousands of missiles. They had built an entirely new class of interceptor aircraft specifically to kill it. They had never succeeded. And all along, the raw material in the aircraft's bones had come from their own ground. No reconnaissance aircraft in history operated in more hostile airspace or with more complete impunity. That is what American engineering produced in a secret facility in Burbank, California, in the early 1960s. Something so far ahead of anything the Soviet Union could build or destroy that the only response available to Moscow was silence. 4,000 missiles, 0 hits, and the titanium came from their own mines.